Welcome to another episode of Fresh Thinking. Our topic today is a review of mineral resource classification strategies part 2. I'm Gregory Zhang, senior consultant with Snowden Optiro. Our guest today is Ian Glacken, executive consultant. Welcome, Ian.
Hi, Greg.
So Ian, can you give us a summarization of the part 1 episode?
Sure. Very briefly, we introduced the topic of resource classification, and we made the point that we were not talking about the qualifications of the person who's classifying the thing. That's for others to discuss, who have discussed it very well. Neither are we talking about this idea of reasonable prospects of eventual economic extraction, which has been covered adequately by us and others. What we are talking about is the techniques. Some of the techniques, not all of them, that can be used to classify mineral resource blocks into measured, indicated, or inferred. And in the first episode specifically, we talked about this idea of the equivalent drill grid spacing, which is a very simple calculation, which is used very commonly. And then we had Graham Lyle, our guest, talk about this idea of the two indicator approach, which was used. So in this episode, we're going to talk a little bit more about this idea of the 90-15 approach.
Okay, so Ian, give us an introduction about what is 90-15 rule.
Right.
Yeah.
Graham mentioned in the first episode the 90-15 approach was developed by Harry Parker and Christina Dom in the 90s. It was formally exposed to the world through publications in the noughties. So the essence is that, as I've mentioned previously, but let's go into it in a bit more detail, we've got three aspects to the classification. We've got the confidence interval. The confidence interval is how often we're wrong, how many times we're outside of a particular range. And in this case, we're using a 90% confidence interval. That means that 9 times out of 10, we're in a specified range. One time out of 10, 1 year out of 10, we're outside that range. So that's how confident we are in the estimate, in the classification. The other aspect is this idea of error. And we talk about 15% error. And the idea of that is that 15% is what you can expect to absorb without ruining the business. So that's the second aspect of it. And the third aspect is the size of the production volume. So typically for a measured resource, we would look at a 3-monthly parcel. For the indicated resource, we would talk about a annual parcel, and then we might not have a parcel size or a production unit volume for the inferred resource. So essentially what we're looking at is how often or how many times our 90% confidence interval is outside the mean plus or minus 15%. And those blocks that meet those criteria would have a lower classification. So that's the essence of the 90-15 approach, Greg.
Okay. So in other words, the inferred classification might just fail the rule defined by the measured or indicated.
It might. And what other companies sometimes would do was, instead of having a 90-15 approach for inferred, they would use a 90-30. In other words, they would have a 30% error as opposed to a 15% error. And in that way, they still have a barrier between inferred and unclassified. So that's quite common. But there's a little bit of flexibility with the inferred. But yeah, that's the essence of the approach. And I would say that this approach is very common among the major companies. You know, most of the companies surrounding us, where we're sitting here in Perth, would follow this approach, and a lot of the junior companies would follow it. So it's become a little bit of a standard in resource classification. It's not universally applied, but it does make sense.
So what are the obstacles to make better use of the 90-15 rule?
Sure. I guess one of the main obstacles is that it's not as straightforward as drill spacing. It's not as straightforward as looking at, say, the kriging variance or the kriging efficiency. It requires an understanding of a confidence interval. I think most people understand that. It requires the understanding of an error, and it requires a judgment on the size of the production parcel. So there's at least three things you've got to think about other than the drill spacing. So that's one issue. Most people would apply this technique using conditional simulation. And I would say that even in 2025, there's still a general lack of expertise in conditional simulation, although compared to where it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago, I think conditional simulation is much more widely used. Now, having said that, it's not essential to use conditional simulation for this approach. But what I would say is that it works best if you're able to use conditional simulation to derive the 90% confidence interval, because this concept of risk is something that comes out of simulation. And the other limitation, I guess, or another issue is that there still is a widely held perception, wrong perception, that drill spacing is all you need, sample spacing is all you need for resource classification. You know, I would say that's absolutely wrong. You need drill spacing, but it's the starting point, and it's an element of a bigger picture. So you know, people that think, or competent persons, qualified persons that think that all we need is a drill spacing, that's not the whole story. And this 90-15 approach goes way beyond the idea of drill spacing. And the other thing I would say, which is what I said in the last podcast, is that the classification that you would derive from the 90-15 is simply the starting point for deriving the ultimate classification. The competent person, the qualified person, needs to make a judgment based on things like geological continuity, structural continuity, data quality, whatever, to the classification, and may need to smooth the outcomes. So this is something that Graham Lyle mentioned in the last episode. So it's important to understand that this approach, which is a mechanical, mathematical approach, it's simply the starting point for a more detailed classification.
So in other words, considering other factors like the sample qualities, so on and so forth, the classification will only lower down further based on this 90-15 rule.
Yeah, that's a good point, Greg. Yes, that's right. If you like the pinnacle of the classification, in other words, the highest confidence you would get from the raw 90-15 approach, and then all of the other criteria will downgrade that. And I think it's important to note that.
Okay, cool. Yeah, let's talk about the scorecards method. So that's also kind of popular. And,
sure.
Yeah,
sure. Scorecards. So scorecards, essentially what we're doing here is we're formalizing something that most competent persons, qualified persons would do anyway, as we've been discussing in this podcast and in the previous part 1. That is looking at one criterion, whether it's drill spacing, kriging efficiency, 90-15 or whatever, and then considering a whole heap of other criteria. So the idea of a scorecard is that we simply formalize that process. So we decide on our criteria, and there might be 10 of them, or 6 or 7 of them. We give them a weight, and that weighting typically is subjective, and it's agreed by maybe not just the competent person, but also by a group of people. And then what we need to do is we need to, or rather the competent person or the qualified person needs to sit down with their experts and give a score to these aspects of it. And that score has a weighting, and that weighting then leads to a category. So really it's as I said to you, it's formalizing practice that is currently done. So and the other good aspect of the checklist is that the scorecard is that it's essentially a checklist of the major issues, so which you need to think about. I would mention a very good paper in this area. It's a paper by Rocha and Bassani from 2023, and we'll put that in the podcast notes.
Okay, so it sounds like we need quite a bit of effort to come to the agreement, which what's the weight going to be assigned to every aspect.
Yep, that's true.
And
that's true.
It will vary between projects or between deposits,
or even within a project. Correct. So that's right. So okay. It's by no means an automatic approach, which I think is one of the strong points.
Okay. So since we've mentioned that, what are the downsides of this method? Except for this.
Sure. Subjective weighting. I mean, that's an issue. I mean, obviously, what we're striving for as much as possible with any type of resource classification is an objective weighting. Now, that's good, and it's good for a big company like BHP or Rio, in that they have 40 or 50 deposits, and they would like their classification by the CPs to be as objective as possible. But at the same time, we need to bear in mind that this scorecard has some subjective aspects to it. Like, for instance, the CP or the QP would make a judgment on the quality of the QC, or maybe the lack of geophysical information, or the structural complexity of the area. So it does involve subjective criteria. Obviously the weighting of these various criteria is subjective. And as you've already mentioned, Greg, we want to try and avoid a situation where if we were just considering the drill spacing, let's say, or the drill spacing and the kriging variance, and then we had very good QA/QC or very good structural information or very good aeromagnetic information or whatever, that would then elevate the category. I think it's important to understand that the classification from the primary criteria, which would be, say, drill spacing or the 90-15 approach or whatever, is the pinnacle, and from there the only way is down. So if you would understand that, and I think that's pretty simple to understand, and if you have a proper group of people that review it, again, bearing in mind that it's the CP, the competent person or the qualified person who has the ultimate say in things, then I think the idea of a scorecard is a very robust approach.
Okay, thanks, Ian. So to bring this to life, is there a high-level case study you can talk about with the application of those methods we've discussed so far?
Sure. Without naming any deposits, a couple of years ago, we applied this idea of the 90-15 approach to a very large porphyry copper deposit, and that involved simulation. So we were simulating copper grades within our geological domains, our mineralization domains. We were then generating for each domain the 90% confidence interval. We were generating the mean of the simulations plus or minus 15%. We were generating the quarterly and the annual production blocks, and then we were able to do those comparisons, and then we were able to apply an initial classification. As it turned out, and this is something that Graham Lyle alluded to in the first podcast, when you have a very large deposit, and these porphyry copper deposits are very large, you tend to have a very optimistic classification, particularly for the indicated. So in this case, we applied the competent person's overlay, and we decided that there was an issue at depth in this ore body with the level of drill spacing, the drilling, in other words. So we were able to downgrade it. So as we've been saying, we started off with the mechanical approach or the formulaic approach, and then we applied the competent person's override. So I think that worked quite well.
Okay, thanks, Ian, for the discussion.
Thank you.
On some other aspects of classification. So there are many approaches, and we have just covered a few of those. So can you tell us some more? Is there any?
No, look, there's many approaches, and I think what in this podcast and the first part one, we've tried to cover some of the major approaches. But what I would say is the one we talked about at the end, the scorecard approach. It's if you like an umbrella that covers a whole heap of other approaches. But what I would say in closing, I say that if you still believe that simply talking about the drill spacing or simply using the drill spacing as the one and only classification criterion, that's not cutting the ice.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Ian. That wraps up today's episode of Fresh Thinking. Thanks for sharing your thoughts, Ian. If you enjoyed this podcast, please hit the subscribe button. Your support is greatly appreciated. Our Fresh Thinking podcasts are available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all the major podcast platforms. Thanks.